I'm Mary Joszewski, and I work for the Friends of the St. Paul Library Foundation. And I'm delighted to introduce you to this Hamlin Fireside reading series. Tonight, we get to listen to David Mura, but first a couple words about Fireside. It is the Friends' longest running program. We've had 29 seasons in partnership with this library, which is really such a community gift. And Fireside is made possible, so you know how we can all stand up here, the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council. And that's thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and also our neighbors, our new neighbors down on Snelling. Minnesota United also supports us. Books are for sale this evening, and if you'd like to buy one, I can help arrange that transaction. They're $25, and there's a short stack on the table back there. They were provided by Black Garnet, which is located on University Avenue in Hamlin, just across from Target. Again, another neighborhood connection. We are so grateful for your support and your presence this evening. I've been to the last few of these, and it's really impressive that neighbors come out on this cold weather and this icy, icy streets to listen to fabulous authors. What a treat. We're going to begin with a reading, and then we're going to open things up for questions. And then when you ask a question, wait till I get to you, and then I'm going to repeat it, because we want to make sure we record this event. It's actually being Zoomed live right now. So not only is this room full of people participating, but we have a whole other virtual audience. So we try to make sure that everybody can hear the questions. Okay, I just had a chance to talk to the author, David Mura, a little bit. I'm really grateful that you wrote the book that you did. Your title is fantastic, and it dovetails with my perceptions of the way things are going perfectly. I look forward to learning more about how you came to this point. David is a poet, a writer of creative nonfiction and fiction. He's a critic and a playwright. Some of his books are A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft in Writing, and memoirs, Turning Japanese, Memories of a Sansai, and Where the Body Meets Memory, an Odyssey of Race, Sexuality, and Identity. He is co-editor with Carolyn Holbrook of We Are Meant to Rise, Voices for Justice from Minneapolis to the World, which was published in Minnesota in 2021. He's going to be talking about his new book tonight. He lives in Minneapolis. I learned that he and his wife, who's also here, live in Prospect Park, right up the street from me. So we are all neighbors here. I'm glad you're here, and welcome.
Thank you. I want to thank the Friends for having me here, and the Hamlin Midway Library, which I've read at least 2 or 3 times before. I'm going to start actually from today in Salon magazine, the online magazine. I had an article, and I'm just going to read the first few paragraphs of that because it's relevant to the book. It's February 1st, 2023, the start of Black History Month. And the New York Times headline reads, "The College Board strips down its AP curriculum for African American Studies." In seeming reaction to Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida banning the earlier version of this course, the College Board removed from the core curriculum any examination of critical race theory, the study of contemporary topics like Black Lives Matter, and writers-scholars like Columbia Law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, Yale professor Roderick Ferguson, Bell Hooks, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. Whether the College Board's revisions were a reaction or not, it's clear that DeSantis and other conservatives have castigated what they believe is the quote-unquote ideological content of the earlier African American Studies AP course. This is a sort of doublespeak that conservatives are so fond of. What they believe is quote-unquote non-ideological, and anything they disagree with is ideological and un-American. Of course, this is hypocritical nonsense, but as Yale historian David Blight has observed, hypocrisy has always been a tool of racism. History, stated the critic Walter Benjamin, is the tale of the victors. In part, he meant that those who win wars, those who have power, are the ones who get to tell history. In this, the telling of history is always ideological, is always a struggle for power. And DeSantis and his ilk know this. That is why they're trying to suppress the teaching of African American history from the point of view of African American writers and scholars. So the article runs into this bit from my book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths in Our American Narratives. From its very beginnings, America had two irreconcilable goals. One was to seek equality, freedom, and democracy. The other was to maintain white supremacy and the domination by white people over any people of color. White America is fine with telling our tale through the lens of this first goal, but it is still decidedly not fine with telling the second story of America's treatment of people of color and America's desire to maintain white supremacy. All the recent ridiculous distorting, disparaging, and damning of critical race theory are just the latest manifestations of this repression. Instead, this second tale, the tale of BIPOC America, is regarded as un-American, unpatriotic, a smear on the past, an abomination to the present, or at best, a minor element. According to some, this story can never be integrated with the story of America's noble pursuit of its ideal goals. And this is an essential way white America has lied to itself. It has denied the voices of people of color as an essential and defining part of America's tale. It has denied their validity as Americans. It has denied that their history is also the history of white America. However, white America wants to deny that fact. For the story of white Americans cannot be understood without comprehending how inextricably and intrinsically that story is intertwined and united with the story of Black America, of Indigenous America, of Americans of color. Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton can describe slavery as, quote unquote, a necessary evil that is safely in our past and needs no further reference. Cotton was in part responding to a curriculum based on the 1619 Project, a new origin story of the New York Times, which placed the initiation of slavery and its after effects as central to the telling of the American story. In a revealing example of how systemic racism works, Senator Cotton concocted a bill, the Saving American History Act, whose purpose was to, quote, prohibit federal funds being made available to teach the 1619 Project curriculum in elementary schools and secondary schools. According to Cotton, the project, quote, threatens the integrity of the Union by denying the true principles on which it was founded. In arguing this, Cotton illustrates a common racist trope. Whiteness makes itself the victim of its own crimes and then tells that tale to itself. Cotton transforms any statement of the fact that white people have been abusing Black people since 1619 into a threat to white people, not to Black people. After all, it is not Black people who think the 1619 Project is a threat to our Union. Frankly, as my burb suggests, this is an abuser psychology at the group level. The problem isn't what white people have done to Black people, but that Black people keep remembering what white people have done. And somehow that harms white people and victimizes them. To which Black people might reply, if we can remember and live with the past and what your ancestors have done to our ancestors, why is it you can't remember and live with the same past? Are you that fragile? Unfortunately, the tales of white victimhood go back to slavery. Slavery was not an act of terror, only the slave rebellion was. And then on to the myth of the lost cause. But of course, we can see this rush to white victimhood in any account of police killings of unarmed Black Americans. Specifically, Cotton objected to the project's assertion that the introduction of slavery could be seen as the creation of America's racial categories, and thus the definition of whiteness, and that this could then be viewed as the origin of America. In other words, Cotton is perfectly fine with telling the story of America through the lens of the principles of equality, freedom, and democracy, and white heroism, but he cannot countenance the story of America where white supremacy is initiated and maintained and plays a central and inextricable role in our history. He wants to wish away or legislate away the fact that this activity was supported by many of those whites whom he regards as heroes. Certainly, in blithely proclaiming the necessity of slavery, Cotton is not regarding as primary or utterly abhorrent the destruction of Black lives and bodies and families. He doesn't want to think about those Black lives. And that is why he objects to the New York Times 1619 Project, which tells a tale of Blacks in America since its inception. Of course, all this denial of history bears a direct connection to his lack of concern for Black lives in the present, to his belief that the mere phrase Black Lives Matter is blasphemous and an attack on America. And in actuality, it is an attack on his version, his white story of America. Certainly, he does not see the story of Black Americans as his story too. And if you cannot face clearly the more obvious and egregious racism of the past and the way it destroyed Black lives, how can you see and face the damage and destruction of Black lives and what Cotton believes is a less racist present? So there's 2 points I want to make in this is the abuser psychology. It is this idea, the abuse is the fault of the abused. And the problem is not the abuse, but that the abused remembers the abuse. The second thing about this is that this idea that the past is in the past. Like, why do we want to remember that Jefferson owned slaves? He enslaved 600 human beings. Why do we want to remember that he impregnated, raped a 16-year-old slave, and then kept his own children as slaves? Now you understand, Sally Hemings was 1/4 Black. So their children were 1/8 Black. People said, Tom, they were you. But because they had Black blood, he kept them as slaves. Now, if I told you there was somebody down the block who had impregnated a 16-year-old girl and kept her as a slave, you would go, that person is horribly sick, is a psycho, we should lock him up. But we're not supposed to say that about Jefferson, are we? Right? I mean, Jefferson was a great man in many ways. We owe many of the principles of the country to him. But he was also the leading ideologist of slavery during this time. Now you might say, well, that was in the past. There's a book that came out last year, a terrific book by Linda Villarosa, Under the Skin, which examines racial disparities in the healthcare system. Things like, Black people are 4.3 times more likely to have their limbs amputated than white people. Like, well, why would that be? Black people wait longer in emergency rooms for pain medication for the exact same condition and illness. And when they receive pain medication, they receive less pain medication than whites for the exact same illnesses and conditions. Now, this happens systemically. I mean, they have statistics that prove this. Now, in 2016, there was a survey of 222 white medical students. And about half of them professed the belief that Blacks feel less physical pain than white people. Okay? Now, if you go back to the 18th century, the 1700s, who's pushing this idea? It's Jefferson. So this idea that blacks feel less pain than white people, Jefferson was injecting into the culture. And it's still infecting the mind of half of these white medical students, some of whom may not actually even think like that's a racist idea. So when we say like, oh, it's in the past, it's not in the past, it's in the present. All right. One of the things when I began this book, in part writing about Black Lives Matter, the demonstrations in Ferguson, and particularly the killing of Philando Castile on Larpenteur Road, which is, I've gone down that road several times myself. I've even got tickets there. But as I began to examine history, I began to realize like this history is still with us. And one of the things and people want to go like, how did we go from Obama to Trump? How did that happen? Right? But if you understand American history, that's what always happened. Throughout our history, any move towards racial progress has been followed by a matching and vigorous effort to return as much as possible to the racist status quo, only by more devious and less overtly stated means, and by skirting recent legal measures towards greater equality. The seemingly official and legal moves towards racial equality were always subsequently undermined, restricted, or rendered moot, and lacked necessary enforcement or power. The question for those who opposed racial progress was how to accomplish the backlash under each new seemingly progressive legal dispensation. Resistant whites understood that they could not acknowledge that their true racist intentions, or at least they could not declare them openly. When it comes to racism, hypocrisy is a deliberate strategy. A basic premise throughout our history is that racism will defend itself through often hard-to-detect intellectual sleights of hand, through camouflaging its workings and creating concepts and premises designed to make racism difficult or impossible to prove. Just as important, until very recently, this history of racial backlash has been thoroughly occluded from the histories students are taught in school, or from popular fictional or cinematic versions of the past. Part of the objection to the 1619 Project of the New York Times is that it argues that a true accounting of our history must include the origins and practice of slavery and all that resulted from that, including the backlash of Reconstruction. As Audre Lorde famously observed, the tools of the master will not dismantle the master's house. And this includes the master's story. In this book, I will make complex analysis regarding the epistemology and ontology of race and how they are tied to whiteness and white identity. And before I want to go into this, it's like people may ask, like, why, David, you need to introduce ontology, epistemology? What does that have to do? So I'm going to define epistemology, ontology, and epistemology, and then I'm going to explain to you why these are important. In the history of America's racial ontology is like the philosophical study of categories, how we categorize and understand the world. So in this racial ontology, white people have created the categories of whiteness and blackness, and these categories continue to structure white identity. That identity is in part based on a belief in the myths, false histories, and racially segregated fictional stories white people tell themselves about themselves. That is, the stories whiteness tells itself, especially about our history, are not an accurate portrait of our history, and yet they continue to structure white identity, i.e. white psychology, in the present. That identity is a psychological distortion based on a denial of what white people have done in the past and what they continue to do in the present. Part of that distortion involves the creation of unblemished white heroes and a version of our history that ameliorates, downplays, or excludes the depths of white racism and white supremacy in our history. I don't think about Jefferson owning slaves. But that distortion also involves the ways in which white history diminishes or excises Blackness from our history. In other words, that identity distorts and occludes the actual lives and consciousness of Black people in our history, what Black people have done and accomplished, what they have suffered and continue to suffer, how they tell their stories. Now, this occurs not just through the content of the stories whiteness tells itself, but through the structures of these stories, structures that often function more at an unconscious rather than unconscious level. One of the things they think about, I talk about later in the book, is white authors never identify their characters as white. If Bill and Bridget are arguing in a kitchen and there's no racial marker, we're to assume that they're white. Now, if I'm portraying my parents arguing in the kitchen, I have to somehow indicate that they're Japanese Americans, that they're Japanese Americans of a certain generation. So what this means is whiteness becomes the universal default. Everything else is the exception. But even more importantly, and really, I don't think white authors really think about this, what they're saying is Bill and Bridget's being white is not important to their identity, is not important to who they are, is not crucial to an understanding of their life experiences. Now, this is not an assumption any person of color would make about Bill and Bridget. If Bill and Bridget are this couple in the Upper West Side arguing, you know, I understand that they're white. And I understand that their lives are going to be different than if they were a Black couple arguing in the Upper West Side. But the white author doesn't think about that, because the white author doesn't think about his or her characters racially. Now, this is unconscious. You can have white authors who would go Black Lives Matter and everything. They're unconscious of how these structures structure their way of thinking. In both unconscious and conscious ways, white identity and the stories it tells itself segregate and separate, wall off white people from the reality of Black people, their history and experiences, the truths Black people have to tell about who we have been as a country and who we are now. White identity thus denies, excludes, and attacks the validity of Black knowledge and the stories Blacks tell themselves. It deems Black epistemology as secondary, minor, extraneous, or invalid, as subjective and always open to an objective white judgment and dismissal. Whiteness must always be epistemologically superior to Blackness, and that is one of the basic principles or rules of white identity. This is the difficult come, so I'm going to explain this to you. White knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. White knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. Black knowledge is always invalid, subjective, false or suspicious, and unofficial, unless whiteness decrees it. Which is why, even though DeSantis is not a historian, he's not a scholar of African American history, he feels he can deem the work of all these scholars as educationally, as not having educational value. And why does he do this? Because he's white. And he knows, like, I get to decree what knowledge is valid. So we think about racism as like down to how we evaluate the knowledge, that we don't evaluate people's knowledge on a neutral, objective plane. That whiteness is always presumed to be valid, true, objective, and official. Then you begin to, and then think about this. It's there when the white medical student listens to the Black patient in the emergency room, and the Black patient says, you know, I'm really feeling pain, doc. And the white medical student is going, no, you really don't feel pain. Right? And they don't even realize, like, they're assuming like a knowledge of this Black person's body that whiteness gives them. right? In this book and its analysis of whiteness, I'm intertwining the historical, theoretical, literary, psychological, ethical, personal, and contemporary in ways I have not seen before, but certainly follow the tradition of James Baldwin. One of the things is if you look at it, I'm taking history, theory, literature, psychology, ethics, personal testimony, contemporary. And people want to say racism is simple, right? The simplification of the way racism works in the society is one of these gaslighting that whiteness does to Americans of color. Because it says, what you see and what you experience, it's totally invalid. Your experiences, your interpretations of experiences, your narratives of your experiences, they're at best secondary, but they tell no truths about who white people are. And it's saying, I have this appendix in the book which says we still have this definition of racism, which is based on individuals. So racism is when somebody hates people of another race, does acts of discrimination or hatred to a person of another race, and does this consciously and admits it. That's the other thing. You have to admit. Now, nobody in America, even David Duke, will not admit to being a racist. So according to this definition, racism doesn't exist in America. Because nobody's ever going to get up in public and say, I discriminated against this person. I hate these people. We know Donald Trump has said that in private, but he hasn't said that in public, right? There's little feints, little hints, little backdoor, or Trump, sometimes it's not so backdoor, it's right in the front door, it's blazing over the entrance. But my point about this is you've given us a definition of racism where racism doesn't exist. And you think I'm so stupid that I'm going to accept this definition that you made up. As opposed to the definition, racism is a system of beliefs, ideas, and practices through which the power and resources of a society are distributed unequally and undemocratically. It's a system. And this system works by conscious means. When people, DeSantis is very conscious of what he's doing. He's going, I'm going to make Black history the villain in order to be elected president. He's very conscious of what he's doing. But I don't think those white medical students who don't give the Black patients in the room, some of them may actually believe, like, I want to treat all my patients equally. They're not aware that they're actually treating their Black patients unequally. And why are they doing it? It's because their minds have been programmed. And then we have to ask, where did that programming come from? And part of the thesis of this book is it comes from our history. It comes from our culture. It comes from the stories that we tell about America. It comes from the ways we define America. I start this book with an essay on the death in 2016 of an African-American man, Philando Castile, who was shot and killed by a police officer in a routine traffic stop in a near suburb of St. Paul. The site of the shooting is not more than a couple miles from my home, and it's a notorious speed trap. I've driven down that stretch of Larpenteur Avenue hundreds of times and even got a couple speeding tickets there. But I don't think I've ever been in danger there in the ways Castile was obviously in danger. Because of my proximity to the site of Castile's murder, and because I know people who knew him and know members of the Black community in St. Paul, his life and death felt particularly close to me. But the implications of his death are more than local. The reasons why he was killed stem back to the beginnings of this country. His murder can be seen as a direct result of the ways that whites have enforced and interpreted the dictates of race, the way whites have tried to script not only their lives, but the lives of people of color. So I'm talking about what is whiteness? It is more multifaceted than many recognize. In part, it consists of prescription, prohibitions for white behavior and thought, a set of do's and don'ts and beliefs about our society. These behaviors and beliefs have served to protect and preserve the racial status quo from the very beginning of America. The ways power is distributed unequally and undemocratically in our society through the categories of race. Here, our history and our stories of the past come to have a greater effect on contemporary America than is generally acknowledged. How we narrate and interpret our racial past structures how we narrate and interpret our racial present. So what do I mean? How we narrate and interpret our racial past structures how we narrate and interpret our racial present. Well, if you don't want to look at Jefferson's racism, it makes it far easier to not look at the racism of the present. If you lower the bar for Jefferson, it makes it easier to lower the bar in the present. So when we say the past is past, it's not. Because the past is not just the past, what happened, it's the way we interpret and contextualize that past. It's who we allow to speak from that past. And if you only allow certain voices to speak from that past, it makes it, and you silence other voices, it makes it far easier to silence the voices in the present. My God, I'm already, what am I at? I'm at the, all right. There's so much in this book I have to go for. I don't know how I can get it in 35. Yeah. What do I want to talk about? Just one of the things I discovered in looking at Philando Castile. After slavery ended, there was a question of what do you do with Black citizens, right? How do we regard them? And one of the things was that Black people could now commit crimes. And there was a whole vast sociological set of pseudoscience, which took any crime by a Black person and said it was evidence of Black criminality. And I don't know how they intellectually did this, but then they took any white crime did not cast a stain on white people. It was just one individual committing a crime. And then, even though they were prejudiced against the Irish at that time, they explained the crimes of the poor people through social economic reasons. Whereas any Black crime was a permanent stain on the Black race. It equated Blackness with criminality. Now, when Officer Yanez comes up to that car, right? And he's thinking about two Black men in dreads, right? Philando Castile's automatically a criminal in his mind. Yanez took a course which said that you should act towards the people you're arresting or stopping as if they're citizens of a foreign, as if you're a occupying force in a foreign country. So Castile's not a fellow citizen. He was taught that, it would be the way that American troops would regard Iraqis in Iraq. And he doesn't see, and he's looking for two Black males. There's a Black female in the next seat and a 4-year-old in the back seat. He doesn't see them. He doesn't see them. And you have to ask, why doesn't he see them? My book ends with ironically, in a telling with essays on George Floyd and Dante Wright. But I want to leave you with, in the Star Tribune, Olivia Rodriguez, a teacher from the North Side. She asked her all-Black class of seventh graders to write a short piece called My America. Here's what she says. Nearly 100% of my class wrote about their fear of police and police brutality. In 7 great words, they expressed unjust behaviors by the authorities toward them. They're 12 and 13 years old. They do not need this weight on their shoulders right now. Their goal should be learning and being a kid. I sat down at my desk and sobbed, thinking of what my students go through on a daily basis while they're walking, playing, and talking while Black. My students are funny, smart, worldly, wise, creative, loving, curious, caring, generous, and independent young people. She ends by saying, right now, they do not feel safe. As a young white child in St. Paul, I felt the police were there to protect me. My students have never felt that. My friend Doug Carney writes in, Carolyn Holbrook and I edited this collection of Minnesota BIPOC writers. And Doug Carney writes this. As my wife had explained to our 10-year-olds who learned explicitly about the then contemporaneous application of this constant historic killing when St. Anthony police officer Geronimo Yanez murdered Philando Castile, it isn't that law enforcement is simply disinterested in protecting Black people, but that U.S. cultural law dictate that our very presence is the thing they're meant to protect against. That white supremacy put me in a position to make this a reasonable conversation to have with my then 6-year-olds is a violence I will never forgive. I will go to work carrying it. I will share social space carrying it. I will form friendships carrying it, yet I will not forgive it. Right now, Moms for Liberty in Tennessee and across the country want to ban books like The Story of Ruby Bridges, the 6-year-old Black girl who desegregated at the New Orleans school in 1960, because they believe it will harm their white children. Now, how you know it's racist is because they don't think my white child could be inspired by Ruby Bridges. My white child could take courage from her courage. My white child could be, these are the ideals of America, which I can share. They don't believe that can happen. They're worried about the fragility of their white children. But how you know it's racist is because they don't care that every single Black parent in this country must tell their kids narratives about police brutality and killings in order to try to keep them safe when they go out in the street. They don't, their children will be harmed by the stories of Ruby Bridges, but Black parents have to tell stories of police killings to their children? We don't care about that. And the thing is, that's just accepted. I worked in a program, and I talk about this a little bit, called The Innocent Classroom. It's a program designed by my friend Alex Pate to train K-12 teachers to improve their relationships with students of color. In the first training session, we asked the teachers, what does America say about children of color? And sometimes they're reluctant, to be honest, but then we get them, we prod them, and they say, you know, gangbangers, you know, violence, angry, sassy, ugly, illegal, strange. And we get this list of 40 to 50 things. And it's a horrifying list. And we tell them, if you know this list, the children know this list. As evidenced by the Olivia Rodriguez's 7th grade class. And what's more, they think you're viewing them through this list many of them. So how are they going to trust you? You have to create a space where they are innocent. You have to create a classroom where these words, these stereotypes have nothing to do with who they are. But it's a very hard task, because where did the kids learn this? Like in one school I worked, the fifth graders, a teacher asked the fifth grade class, fifth graders, they came up with the same list that the teachers did. And then they discussed it for fifth graders. For 45 minutes, they discussed the list. And then one of them asked, well, what's the solution to the list? Another one said, education. And then another one said, well, we're screwing with our education. Aren't we screwing with the antidote? They were undergoing an education. They were educating themselves in how systemic racism works. That's the type of critical race thinking that people like DeSantis don't want the kids to be engaged in. And at the end of it, what is the result? They valued their education more. And that's another reason why DeSantis doesn't want African American studies to be taught. Because it actually helps kids of color. And he does not want to do that. I wrote this book because I care about these issues. My parents were imprisoned by the US government in World War II. They were 11 and 15. And my uncle and my second uncle served in the Japanese intelligence school at Fort Snelling that I just did a TPT documentary, Armed Language. And they went out in the Pacific, even while their families were imprisoned behind barbed wire and under rifle tower guards, because they believed in America. And MacArthur's chief of intelligence said that they shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and probably saved 1 million American lives. Which means there are white Americans now who hate Asians or immigrants who are actually alive today because of the work of these Japanese American soldiers. That's our greatness. That's what makes this country great. And I'm talking to this, I think where we on the left have gone wrong is, I don't want to shame people. I don't want to guilt people. You don't change people through shame and guilt. You change them through love. You change them through knowledge. And in the end, I just don't understand. America's a great country. It can accommodate everybody. We're here because of the stories of everybody. Ideas of democracy, many scholars believe our ideas about democracy were influenced by Native Americans, by Native American traditions. That's not taught in our schools. American music, you can't imagine without African Americans. Our history, Black Americans in every single point in our history have been on the right side of history. And the majority of white population, anytime about slavery, about civil rights, have always been on the wrong side of history. White Americans never turned to Black America and said, we got it wrong every single time in our history. Maybe we'll follow you now in the present. That's what I want to happen. Thank you.
Anyone has a question? I can run over, turn on the mic, and then I'll repeat it so that the online audience can hear it and this audience can hear it. All right, I'm running over there right now. Go ahead.
So my question is, I'm really curious about the fact that implicit.
Actually, you have to take the mic.
I'm sorry, you're right. You're right about that
holding the
part.
mic.
Duh. Thank you. It's attached to me. But actually, the bigger thing is I'm going to repeat it. Thank you.
Okay, so my question is about implicit bias. and you never use that term. I'm just curious about that.
Well, when I say
question-
unconscious bias, I'm talking about implicit bias.
question was about-
Yeah.
Oh, I know that. Is
Yeah.
there a reason that you don't?
No, no, it just,
Okay,
it just, rather than explain it, what the term, people understand more readily, unconscious bias. So if I was teaching a class, I would call it implicit bias, but I have 35 minutes here. I have a lot to explain, right? So I'm trying to make it as easily understandable as possible, right?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. The Zoom can hear you through this microphone.
Okay.
And I'll repeat it.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for your work, and you've clearly been thinking and writing about and studying these issues for a long time. And it sounds like this book brings together a lot of those connecting threads with your experience. And so I'm just wondering if there was something new or unexpected or challenging that came up as you were researching this book, something that surprised you.
The question is, was there anything new, unexpected, or
So
challenging?
many different things, like, I'm a boomer. I was taught, the slaves were free. Emancipation Proclamation 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. I didn't know much about the history of Reconstruction, although it seems logical. You think, oh, Blacks are now free and citizens. That doesn't mean that every white person in the South suddenly went, oh, Black people are equal. And in fact, what they did, as I say in the introduction, is they tried to reestablish slavery under a different name, under indentured servitude, under apprenticeships, under the Black codes, which said that if a Black person were not literally working for a white person, they could be arrested, not just by the police, but by any white person. So after a certain point, there were over 100,000 Black Americans who were in prison. And once they were in prison, they were part of the slave labor system. Only we didn't call it slave labor, right? But what also happened was there were complex legal maneuvers that occurred during that time to reestablish slavery and discrimination. It's like the Supreme Court ruled that racial hatred and discrimination was not intrinsic to slavery. And so the Emancipation Proclamation did not ban that. There were efforts to expand what the definition of private realm, so that the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment only applied in the public realm. So if you expand the private realm, right, which we see today in various ways, this debate between what is private and what is public, it's the exact same debate. And so people had to think to invent racism. Yes, there was obvious terror, violence, but the smartest people in the South were thinking about this. And they established a system of Jim Crow, which was such a complete system that when South Africa said, we want to establish apartheid, they went, oh my God, America's already done that. We just need to follow their lesson, right? So the history of the backlash is something I didn't understand, right? How deeply entrenched and how extensive the thinking was, right? I mean, because we do this thing where you always have this image of some crazy white person who's a racist, right? We don't have this image of Jefferson, one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, thinking how to justify slavery. And then the blindness that occurred to him, because it's just crazy. I mean, he had Black people working as architects and engineers on his plantation, and yet he said, like, they're inferior. Or Lincoln's racism, when Black ministers came to the White House and they thought they were going to have a dialogue with Lincoln, he told them, you can never be part of America. The best of you is not better than the least of white people. You know, and people want to say, well, you got to judge Lincoln against his times, right? Now, when they say this, they're not thinking, well, the British abolished slavery a few decades before, but they're also not thinking, what did Black Americans think? Black Americans would have recognized Lincoln as racist. Those Black ministers that went to the, you know, to the White House and have been taught, you're not equal with me, but they're not part of the moral climate of their times. And when you say that, what you're saying in the present is that those Black Americans were not part of America, that their moral judgment of Lincoln doesn't matter, which is simply racist, right? So part of this is, and these categories of epistemology, I've been influenced by Alex Pate, my friend Alex Pate, and my friend Frank Wilderson. Frank talks a lot about ontology and categories of blackness and whiteness. Alex talks a lot about knowledge and epistemology. And I began thinking about this, and the more I thought about it, the more I saw how this idea of white knowledge as being valid, true, objective, and official is the underpinning, the intellectual underpinning of white supremacy. And we have not abandoned that. The other thing I discovered near the end is you know, I realized that white people react to racism to like the 5 stages of Helen Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages of grief. First, there's denial. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Then it's anger. Why are you bringing this up? There was no problem before you started bringing this up. Then it's bargaining. Well, yeah, there's a few bad apples. Well, Chris Rock said, would you want to fly on an airline that had a few bad apples? Would you want to be operated on a surgery department that had a few bad apples? Oh, it can't be that extensive. And then, oh my God, it is. I feel so ashamed about being white. I feel so terrible about it. How do you deal with this? And that's grief. And then in the end, it's acceptance. And once you accept this, then it's like you stop spending all this energy to fight it, to be in denial. You just go, yeah, that's the way it was. That's the way it is. Let's start working on it. And what that means actually is you've reached a different psychological and spiritual stage. Because this journey, we talk about it in terms of politics, but in many ways it's a spiritual, psychological journey. Because white America is still in denial about race. And so that's something that I sort of discovered at the end of the book.
I'm sorry, but
Could we have just one more?
For one more question. This is my brother-in-law, and I think something I've, kind of become Japanese Americans in America.
Mhm.
And like history, just the story you just shared was so powerful about how you had relatives that were in internment camp, but then still went off and fought. And what are your thoughts about all of that? And then what is the huge backlash right now against people who are Asian descent in the United States?
Well, what I say about blackness is always, the categories of blackness have been white is human, therefore is citizen. Black is inhuman, therefore not citizen. What violence can only be done to white people if they break the law or war is declared. Violence can be done to the black body without justification. You don't have to break, it's not, you don't need to prove that they broke the law or that there's a war. Black people did not have their progeny, their offspring were not their own, right? They could be sold, bought and sold, right? Those were the categories. The category of Asian has always been, you're the perpetual foreigner. You will never become part of America. You are always a potential fifth column, spies, the Oriental terrorists. And so my grandfather came here in 1898. And yet during COVID, a reporter from the Star Tribune at the Mall of America came and asked me, what do your relatives in China think about the pandemic? And then I explained to him I wasn't Chinese, I was Japanese, right? And he says, well, what do your relatives think about it? Now, nobody would ask, like there's something happened in Germany now, and your German grandfather had come from Germany in 1898. Nobody asked, well, what do you think about what Germans think, right? So I understand there's a certain way, I will never be American. I will always be asked where I'm from. I will always be minor. But there's an advantage to that. I see things, right? And I don't presume things, right? So the COVID thing was just like trouble in Asia. Let's, and it doesn't matter, when Trump says the Kung flu and the Chinese virus and the Wuhan virus, it doesn't matter that I'm Japanese. It doesn't matter if you're Filipino, you're Asian, right? And so we're going to attack you. And then all of this is a reaction to Obama and a reaction to the knowledge that in 2040, after that, white people are no longer going to be the majority in this country. And a portion of the white population is freaked out about this. Just as they were freaked out by Obama's election. Now, to me, part of this is a form of insanity, right? I mean, if there's anything proved by Black history, it's that Black people believe in America. They believe in the ideals of America. And they actually believe in them more than white people do. So this fear, it's projection. It's my hatred and fear of you. I fear that you're going to project fear and hatred towards me. Right? And it's the same thing with Asian Americans. It's like I can never really become part of America. Even though, like the other Japanese American unit in Europe, they were the most decorated unit in Europe. Generals fought to have them under the command because they got things done that no other troops. They rescued this lost battalion of Texans that were trapped behind Nazi lines and nobody else could do. And I talked to one of the soldiers and he said, normal troops, when you get a certain percentage of people being killed, you retreat. He said, we never retreated. So that in certain units, there were like 12 people out of 80 left. They fought because of a belief in America. So why you would be afraid of me, I think is a form of insanity. But racism is a form of insanity. Thank you.
Well,